Imagine being Rachel Reeves right now. You wake up, check your phone, and the first thing you see is that Britain has borrowed £132 billion in just 8 months. Not over several years, not across a decade of spending, but 8 months. That is £16.8 billion more than the expert predicted, $10 billion more than last year, and the highest borrowing on record outside of pandemic years when the entire country was locked down and the government was paying everyone's wages. You are the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You raised taxes to record levels promising it would fix everything, and somehow the borrowing has got worse, not better. The Shadow Chancellor is calling you reckless. Reform UK is accusing you of bankrupting Britain, and rumour has it the Prime Minister is losing patience faster than the pound is losing value. If that does not qualify as a career crisis requiring several stiff drinks and possibly a therapist, I do not know what does. Welcome to the absolute disaster zone that is Rachel Reeves' Treasury, where the numbers keep getting worse, the excuses keep getting thinner, and the political knives are being sharpened with alarming enthusiasm. Quick favor, if you are loving this, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell. Over 94% of you have not subscribed yet. It is completely free, takes 2 seconds, and helps us bring you this content. Cheers if you did. Now back to the show. So let us dive into these absolutely catastrophic figures that landed on Rachel Reeves' desk this morning like a bomb through the window. £132 billion borrowed in the first 8 months of the financial year. To put that in perspective, that is more money than most people can even conceptualize. If you earn £50,000 a year, it would take you 2.6 million years to earn that much money. The entire GDP of countries like Morocco or Ecuador is around that figure. This is not just a big number. This is an astronomically massive number that represents fundamental problems with how the government is managing the nation's finances. And here's what makes it even worse. This is happening during a period of record high taxes. Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's government have squeezed British taxpayers harder than they have been squeezed in generations. National insurance contributions are up. Various stealth taxes are kicking in. The tax burden as a percentage of GDP is at levels not seen since the immediate post-war period. The government is taking more money from people's pockets than at almost any other point in modern history. And despite all of that revenue flooding into the Treasury, they are still borrowing at record levels. It is like someone who has 3 jobs, works 80 hours a week, and is still maxing out their credit cards every month. At some point, you have to ask what on earth they are spending the money on. The Office of Budget Responsibility, those lovely cheerful folks whose job is to tell the government when their sums do not add up, had forecast borrowing levels back in March. They looked at the government's plans, ran the numbers, and predicted what borrowing would be. They were wrong by £16.8 billion. Now, economic forecasting is not an exact science, and being off by a few billion is somewhat understandable given the complexity of the economy. But being off by nearly £17 billion suggests either the forecasts were wildly optimistic, or the government spending has spiraled completely out of control since those forecasts were made, or quite possibly both. Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor and top Tory who has been waiting for precisely this kind of moment, absolutely tore into Reeves over these figures. He described them as even more reckless spending by Labour, and frankly, when you look at the numbers, it is hard to argue with that characterization. Stride pointed out that borrowing this year is the highest on record outside of the pandemic, and that at the budget, Labour chose to pile on even more spending and debt. This is a political equivalent of someone whose house is on fire deciding that now would be a great time to throw petrol on the flames. But Stride did not stop at general criticism. He got specific, pointing to Labour's decision to scrap the 2-child benefit cap and abandon welfare reform as examples of irresponsible spending that requires more borrowing. Now, whether you agree with the 2-child cap or not is a matter of political philosophy and values. Some people think it is cruel to limit benefits based on family size. Others think it is fiscally responsible to discourage people from having children they cannot afford to support. But what is undeniable is that scrapping it costs money the government apparently does not have if they are already borrowing at record levels. Stride accused Labour of heaping costs on the next generation and weakening the economy. This is a classic conservative argument. The idea that excessive government borrowing today means higher taxes and debt repayment tomorrow, burdening future taxpayers with the consequences of today's political decisions. It is like running up massive credit card debt and then handing the bills to your children. Whether you find this argument compelling probably depends on your political worldview, but it is certainly true that £132 billion of borrowing will need to be repaid eventually, and that money will have to come from somewhere. In classic opposition fashion, Stride then promoted the Conservative plan, claiming they have a £47 billion savings package and something called a golden economic rule to reduce the deficit. He finished with a kind of political rhetoric that would make a party conference audience stand and cheer, declaring that only the Conservatives have a leader with a backbone, the plan, and the team to cut borrowing and deliver a stronger economy. Whether the Conservatives would actually do any better is debatable given their own record in government, but when your opponent is presiding over record borrowing despite record taxes, criticism practically writes itself. And then we have Richard Tice from Reform UK, never one to mince words or miss an opportunity to stick the boot in. His assessment was brutal and concise. Reeves is bankrupting Britain. Spending and debt are out of control. Growth is zero, and jobs are falling. It is a kind of soundbite that cuts through because it is simple, direct, and taps into genuine concerns that many voters have. They see their taxes going up, they see government borrowing increasing, and they do not see corresponding improvements in public services or economic growth. When someone like Ty stands up and says the Chancellor is bankrupting the country, it resonates because it matches people's lived experience. Now, before we completely write off Rachel Reeves and assume she is about to be sacked or resigned in disgrace, we should mention that there was actually some good news buried in these figures. The Office for National Statistics pointed out that public sector net borrowing for the month of November specifically was £11.7 billion, which was $1.9 billion less than November of the previous year, and the lowest for any November in 4 years. So if you squint really hard and focus only on one specific month, things look slightly better. But here's a kicker: the reason that single month looked better: higher taxes. Tom Davies, senior statistician in the ONS, made this explicitly clear. The main reason for the drop from last year was increased receipts from taxes and national insurance contributions. In other words, November looked better because the government extracted more money from taxpayers, not because spending was under control or the economy was performing better. It is like saying your personal finances improved because you got a second job, whilst conveniently ignoring that you are also spending more than ever and your credit card debt is climbing. The underlying problem has not been solved. You have just found a new source of income to temporarily mask it. And Davies made sure to add the crucial caveat: across the financial year to date as a whole, borrowing is higher than last year. So yes, November looked marginally better, but zoom out to the bigger picture and the trend is absolutely dire. This is the equivalent of someone on a sinking ship pointing out that the water level in one particular cabin has not risen as fast as expected, whilst ignoring that the overall ship is still sinking at an alarming rate. James Murray, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, was wheeled out to defend these numbers and try to put a positive spin on what is objectively terrible news. His argument was that every penny of taxpayers' money should be spent wisely, which is a kind of statement that is simultaneously completely true and completely meaningless. Of course, every penny should be spent wisely. Who would argue against that? The problem is that £132 billion of borrowing in 8 months suggests that not every penny is being spent wisely, unless the government's definition of wise spending is radically different from what normal people would understand. Murray then pivoted to talking about debt interest, pointing out that £1 in every 10 the government spends goes on servicing debt. This is actually a genuinely important and alarming point. 10% of all government spending is just paying interest on money we have already borrowed. That is money that could be going to schools, hospitals, police, infrastructure, or literally anything else useful, but instead it is going to bondholders and financial institutions as payment for lending Britain money. It is like spending 10% of your salary just on credit card interest payments. It is a sign that your finances are fundamentally unhealthy and unsustainable. And then Murray trotted out the standard line that the Chancellor's budget delivers on the pledge to cut debt and borrowing. Except, and this is important, the figures released this very morning show that borrowing is not being cut. It is higher than last year and higher than forecast. So either the budget has not yet had time to have its intended effect, or the budget's projections are as wildly optimistic as previous forecasts have been, or Murray is simply hoping that if he says it confidently enough, people will believe it despite all evidence to the contrary. This is the problem with modern political communication. Politicians stand up and make confident declarations about how their policies will fix everything, but then when the actual numbers come in showing that things are getting worse, they just repeat the same confident declarations with slightly different phrasing and hope nobody notices a contradiction. It is gaslighting on a national scale. We are told taxes are being raised to fix the public finances, then borrowing goes up. We are told the budget will cut debt, then debt increases. At some point, people stop believing the words and start focusing on the numbers, and the numbers are telling a story that is very different from the one the government wants us to hear. So what does all of this mean for Rachel Reeves personally? The title of this video suggests Starmer has given her a last warning, and whilst we cannot confirm the exact nature of private conversations between the Prime Minister and his Chancellor, it is not hard to imagine that those conversations are becoming increasingly tense. Chancellors live and die by economic performance.